In 1881, Thomas Carnegie owned 17 6/10% of Carnegie Brothers and Company. His older brother Andrew owned more than half. Andrew's name went into the newspapers. Andrew's face went into the mythology of American wealth. Thomas ran the mills, kept the ledgers, and spent his share building a 59-room mansion on a barrier island off the coast of Georgia. A house with its own golf course, its own swimming pools, its own private railroad platform, standing on land that would eventually amount to 90% of that island. He died of pneumonia in 1886, at 44, barely a year after the house was finished. 15 years later, his brother sold the company for $480 million and became, for a season, the richest man alive. Thomas was not there to collect any of it. Today, the island permits 300 visitors a day, reachable only by ferry. No bridge, no rental cars, no hotel chain. The mansion Thomas Carnegie built stands without a roof, grazed by wild horses that answer to no one. This is the story of a fortune one brother never lived to spend, and an empire the other left behind to come apart in the salt air. Chapter 1. The Island. Cumberland Island runs 18 miles along the Georgia coast, the largest of the state's barrier islands, and for most of its length it does not look inhabited at all. Maritime forest closes over the interior. Salt marsh spreads west toward the mainland, green and gold and tidal, indifferent to whoever claims to own it. To the east, 17 miles of Atlantic beach lie undeveloped. No boardwalk, no pier, no lights. And over nearly all of it, live oaks hold their canopies low and wide, draped in Spanish moss that does not kill the tree it hangs from but outlives it anyway. Those oaks will matter later. They are patient in a way nothing built by a Carnegie, or by anyone before a Carnegie, has ever managed to be. Before any steel fortune touched this ground, the island belonged to others in sequence, the way land on a coast like this one always does. Timucua villages worked its marshes for centuries, fishing the tidal creeks, moving with the seasons. A Spanish mission followed, raised on high ground the Timucua had likely occupied first. Then came English plantations, and after them American ones, men who cleared what forest they needed and planted what the soil would carry, on ground that had already changed hands more than once before they arrived. Cumberland Island, by the time of the American Revolution, was not virgin territory. It was inherited property with a long memory. Enter Nathaniel Greene. In 1783, the Revolutionary War general, George Washington's most trusted field commander, the man who had worn down Cornwallis's army in the Carolinas without ever quite beating it outright, acquired roughly 11,000 acres of the island. He did not buy it in the ordinary sense. He took it in payment of a wartime debt, the kind of transaction that turned soldiers into landowners across the young republic and left men who had spent a war moving armies suddenly responsible for moving crops instead. Greene did not live to see what his widow would build on it. He died in 1786, 3 years after the acquisition, and the island passed to Catherine. Catherine Greene remarried to Phineas Miller, once her husband's plantation manager. And together, in the early 1800s, they raised a mansion on the site, 4 stories of tabby, that coastal concrete of oyster shell and lime and sand, pale and dense and built to outlast a hurricane. They named it Dungeness. It was not the first structure to carry that name on this coast, and it would not be the last, but it was the one that mattered. A great house standing alone on a barrier island, visible from the water, a private civilization asserting itself against marsh and tide. In 1818, Henry Lee, cavalry officer of the Revolution, a man they had called Light Horse Harry, and father to a boy not yet named Robert E. Lee, arrived at Dungeness dying and stayed there until he was dead. He was buried on the island with full military honors in the shadow of the house Catherine Greene had built, a general's widow's mansion holding the body of another general's father. The island had already, within a single generation, become a place where the powerful came to end. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, or perhaps not far enough ahead, because that first Dungeness did not survive to greet the family this story is actually about. Somewhere in the decades between Henry Lee's funeral and the arrival of a Pittsburgh steel fortune, the mansion burned. What tabby and timber the fire left standing collapsed under weather and time, until there was no house at all, only a ruin, and the oaks moving in around it, and the moss doing what the moss always does. By the time anyone connected to Carnegie Brothers set foot on Cumberland Island, that ruin was not a hypothetical. It was the only precedent the land offered. The island, in other words, was already practiced at this. It had buried a general's father and burned a general's widow's house before a single Carnegie ever crossed the Sound to look at it. What happened next would carry the same name. Chapter 2. The Brothers. By 1881, the name Carnegie already meant something in Pittsburgh, and it did not mean Andrew alone. Thomas Morrison. Carnegie, younger by 5 years, had spent 2 decades inside the machinery of his older brother's ascent, first as a boy clerk, then as a partner, then as the man who actually ran the mills, while Andrew wrote and traveled and gave speeches on the gospel of wealth. Thomas held roughly 17.6% of Carnegie Brothers and Company, a partnership built on the Edgar Thomson Steel Works and the Lucy furnaces, the latter named for his own wife. Andrew held more than half the firm and nearly all of its public identity. Thomas held the operations, the furnace schedules, the daily accounting of a business already generating one of the largest private fortunes in industrial America. He almost never appeared in the newspapers. That was not accident. It was arrangement. He had come up through the company town rather than around it. Pittsburgh born, Pittsburgh trained, a partner by his 20s, a man who signed ledgers instead of speeches. Where Andrew performed the empire, Thomas administered it. Historians of the firm would later note the asymmetry as if it were a curiosity. Inside the family, it was simply a division of labor, the younger brother absorbing the weight so the elder could hold the light. In 1881, Thomas married into a fortune of comparable weight. Lucy Coleman Carnegie came from a wealthy Pittsburgh family in her own right, daughter of a coal and iron man, raised inside the same industrial aristocracy that had produced her husband. The marriage did not rescue either side. It merged 2 balance sheets that were already substantial, and it produced, that same year, a decision that had nothing to do with steel at all. Thomas and Lucy bought land on Cumberland Island, Georgia, on the ruined grounds of the old Dungeness plantation. They came at first only for winters, a retreat from Pittsburgh's furnace smoke, purchased with furnace money. But the land they had bought carried a structure already, or the remains of one, the tabby walls of Catherine Green's mansion, the same house that had hosted Light Horse Harry Lee's funeral in 1818, the same house that had already burned and settled into the marsh grass before either Carnegie had been born. 3 years passed before they built on it directly. In 1884, construction began on a new Dungeness, raised on the identical footprint of the one the island had already taken back. It took a year. In 1885, the house was finished. A sprawling Queen Anne mansion, its own golf course laid into the maritime scrub, its own swimming pools, dozens of smaller buildings scattered around it to house a live-in staff sufficient for a family that would eventually number 9 children. Turrets rose where tabby rubble had been. Verandas wrapped around a lawn that had once been overgrown ruin. Thomas and Lucy furnished it as a winter seat for a dynasty they expected to occupy it for generations, on ground that had already proven, once, exactly how long these things last. The house was finished. Thomas Carnegie was 43 years old. Chapter 3. The Widow. Thomas Carnegie died in January 1886 of pneumonia at 44. He had spent 5 years as a founding partner in one of the largest steel operations in the country. He had spent a single winter enjoying the house he built to hold his family for decades. The arithmetic of that trade would not have been lost on him had he lived to consider it. His brother did not stop. Andrew Carnegie went on to sell Carnegie Steel in 1901 for $480 million, and for a brief interval became the richest man in the world. Thomas never saw a dollar of it. He had helped build the machine that made his brother's fortune possible, had run its furnaces and its ledgers, while Andrew ran its reputation, and he was 15 years in the ground before the sale that would have made him one of the wealthiest men in America, instead made him a footnote to his brother's arithmetic. Lucy Carnegie was 37 when she was widowed. She did not retreat to the mainland. She did not sell the house, or the land, or the name. She took control of the island, not as a caretaker preserving her husband's project, but as an actual proprietor extending it, deciding what Cumberland Island would become and building it herself, year after year for the next 3 decades. The land came first. Thomas and Lucy had bought the ruined Dungeness footprint in 1881. Over the following decades, Lucy bought nearly everything else. Parcel by parcel, family by family, she assembled almost the entire island under Carnegie ownership. 18 miles of barrier island, marsh to ocean, absorbed into a single private holding by a widow who had inherited a mansion and turned it into a nation. She wanted recognition to match the ambition, and she pursued it the way she pursued the land, patiently and to completion. The New York Yacht Club had never admitted a woman. After years of petitioning, Lucy Carnegie became the first. The club that had refused her sex for its entire history made an exception for her specifically, which was, in its way, the only kind of concession Cumberland Island's new proprietor was interested in. She raised 9 children largely on the island, and she treated each marriage the way she treated each acre of unclaimed shoreline, as territory to be developed. As every child married, Lucy built the couple a house of their own, not a wedding gift in the ordinary sense, an estate. The first came for her son George. Between 1898 and 1906, Lucy built Plum Orchard for George and his wife Margaret Thaw, a Georgian revival mansion designed by the Boston firm Peabody and Stearns. The original budget was $10,000, a builder's estimate for a comfortable house, nothing more. Margaret Thaw came from a family wealthier even than the Carnegies, and she was not interested in comfortable. She financed 2 additional wings herself, and the house that emerged from the marsh grass was not the $10,000 cottage Lucy had first drawn up. It was 22,000 square feet, a mansion built to outscale the mansion it was meant to be a gift from. Plum Orchard was finished in 1906. It was the first of 4 houses Lucy Carnegie would build on Cumberland Island for her children. It would not be the last, and it would not be the largest. By the time she was done, the island would hold a cluster of private estates answering to a single family name, each one built by a widow who had inherited a single house and turned it into something closer to a private nation. The other 3 were still to come. Chapter 4. The Private Nation. By the early 1900s, Cumberland Island functioned less like a vacation property than a private nation. It had its own economy, built on wages paid to workers who might otherwise have found employment in the sawmills and shipyards of the Georgia coast. Its government was informal but absolute. Sastrin and Skashro run first from Lucy Carnegie's desk, and later, as her children came of age, from theirs. Its domestic architecture expanded house by house across 2 decades of construction, and by the turn of the century, it had 4 palaces, each built by or for a Carnegie, each standing as a fact of the family's reach across the marsh and pine of the Georgia coast. Dungeness anchored the island's southern end, a sprawl of brick and Georgian symmetry, raised on the footprint of a ruin. Plum Orchard rose to the north, its portico facing the marsh, built for a son on a budget that tripled before the roof went on. Grayfield stood smaller and plainer, a house built as a wedding gift rather than a monument. Stafford carried the old cotton plantation foundations under new Carnegie brick and a fresh layer of family ambition. 4 houses, 4 households, one name, repeated in shingle and stone from one end of Cumberland Island to the other. Around the 4 mansions stood nearly 40 smaller structures, the working machinery of an estate that supplied almost everything it needed without ever touching the mainland. An ice house preserved meat through the humidity of a Georgia summer. A dairy produced milk and butter for children who would grow up never once buying either. Stables held horses and carriages. Workshops turned out the repairs that kept the household running. Rows of cottages sheltered the families who worked it. The permanent population living inside this arrangement, servants, groundskeepers, carpenters, boatmen, occupied ground that almost no other American of the era would ever set foot on. Of the 4 houses, Dungeness carried the weight of first arrival, the one guests saw before any other, and it is Dungeness that shows most clearly what that private nation looked like from the inside. Picture Dungeness on a winter evening in the 1890s. Lanterns ring the 2 swimming pools, their light trembling across black water, while beyond them, a 9-hole golf course runs off into the dark toward the marsh. At the private wharf, the family's own yachts sit at anchor beside steamers carrying guests down from Pittsburgh and New York. Guests who travel this way because there is no bridge to Cumberland Island, and never will be. The only road in is water, out of St. Mary's, by private boat. Inside, 59 rooms hold imported furniture and fine art under gaslight, room opening onto room, on a scale that makes even guests who arrived wealthy in their own right stop in the doorway and stare. Past the lantern light, the island goes dark and silent within a few hundred yards, as though the house were the only fact on Cumberland Island that winter. And for the length of that evening, it very nearly was. The Carnegie children grew up inside that darkness too, riding horses across beaches with no roads, no street lights, and no neighbors beyond their own family name. The horses were not a Carnegie invention. English colonists had already turned animals loose on Cumberland Island by the 1740s, and wild bloodlines were running through its dune grass a century and a half before any Carnegie set foot on the sand. The family added its own stock to that herd and did what the English before them had done. Let the animals go, and let the island keep them. No one at Dungeness in the 1890s counted how many horses ran loose across the estate, or asked what would happen to them once the family that owned the land was gone. Chapter 5. The Compound at its Zenith. By 1916, Lucy Carnegie had spent 30 years converting a barrier island into a private dominion, and the accounting of what she had built read like an inventory of a small nation rather than a household. Dungeness, the house her husband had raised in 59 rooms, had grown under her direction into a complex reported at roughly 35,000 square feet. A structure that had nearly doubled in scale since Thomas's death, expanding room by room as though the building itself were compensating for the man who had not lived to see it finished. She died that year, having outlived her husband by 3 decades. She left behind 9 children, 4 completed mansions, and an island that was, in all but name, entirely hers. A fortune assembled not through inheritance alone, but through 3 decades of acquisition, negotiation, and construction contracts signed in her own hand. The island she left behind was not merely a collection of houses. It was, by the mid-1910s, a functioning municipality that answered to no mayor and paid no local taxes to speak of, because it owned the ground beneath itself. There was a dairy, producing milk and butter, for a household that numbered in the dozens, even in the family's absence. There was a laundry building, processing linens for 4 mansions simultaneously. There was a small fire department, staffed and equipped, because the nearest municipal engine company was a boat ride away, and a lit lantern in a house full of imported furniture was not a risk anyone on the island cared to run. No comparable residential holding on the Atlantic coast combined this much private acreage with this much private infrastructure under one family's name. By some measures, the largest privately owned residential compound on the eastern seaboard of the United States, Andrew Carnegie died in 1919 in Massachusetts, having given away the greater part of a $350 million fortune to libraries and foundations that bore his name. On Cumberland Island, his brother's descendants did not slow down. The dividends kept arriving. First from Carnegie Steel, then, after the 1901 merger, from United States Steel. And the money did what money accustomed to compounding tends to do. It kept building. Construction continued into the 1920s at a pace that assumed the arrangement was permanent, that the tide of steel dividends would rise indefinitely, and the island would simply keep absorbing it, wing by wing, outbuilding by outbuilding. George Carnegie, Thomas and Lucy's son, had made Plum Orchard his primary winter residence. The 22,000-square-foot house his mother built for him between 1898 and 1906, later expanded by his wife Margaret Thaw Carnegie, into something closer to a private resort than a residence. It held an indoor swimming pool. It held a squash court. Both were extraordinary amenities for a structure reachable only by boat, dependent on generators and imported labor for their upkeep, built at a scale that made no concession to the isolation surrounding it. George died there in 1921, at 54, a second Carnegie man gone before old age, echoing his father's death 35 years earlier. Though this time the estate did not pass to a young widow forced to build an empire from nothing, Margaret Thaw Carnegie simply kept funding the upkeep year after year of a house built for a marriage that had already ended. The builders, one by one, were gone. Thomas in 1886, Lucy in 1916, Andrew in 1919, George in 1921. What remained was the compound itself. 4 mansions, 40 outbuildings, a dairy, a laundry, a fire department, a herd of horses no one had ever formerly owned, standing on 90% of an island, waiting for someone still living to decide what came next. Chapter 6. What the Fire Left Standing. The Depression did not announce itself at Dungeness with headlines or auction notices. It arrived instead as absence, a housemaid not replaced, a groundskeeper's position left vacant through one winter, then another. The Carnegie fortune, spread by then across railroads, steel holdings long since sold to Morgan, and a dozen quieter investments meant no mansion on Cumberland Island was ever put up for sale to cover a debt. But a fortune survives differently than a household does. The staff that had once numbered in the dozens at each of the 4 estates thinned year by year, and no one troubled to write down the date it happened. By the 1930s and on through the 1940s, Dungeness stood mostly closed. Rooms were sheeted against dust. The kitchens that had once fed a house full of family and guests through an entire winter season went cold for months at a stretch, tended by a skeleton crew of caretakers whose job was simply to keep the roof from leaking and the horses from wandering in through the terrace doors. The island's golden age, some 4 decades, running from Thomas Carnegie's arrival in 1885 to the mid-1920s, was already over, though the buildings that had defined it were all still standing. An era, it turns out, does not require its architecture to end. It only requires the people, and then, in 1959, Dungeness burned. The accounts that survive on the island describe a caretaker who had shot a man caught poaching deer on the property. The man survived his wounds, was hospitalized, and was released. According to that same account, he returned to Cumberland Island afterward and set fire to the mansion. Whatever the precise sequence, the result was not in dispute. The roof was gone within hours, along with the floors and the 59 rooms of furniture, paintings, and the accumulated inheritance of 3 generations, on an island with no fire department and no way to summon one in time. What remained standing, when the flames finally burned themselves out, was brick and stone. the shell of the walls, open to the sky, on the same footprint where an older ruin had stood before Thomas Carnegie ever broke ground. The Carnegie family did not rebuild it. The fire did not merely destroy a house, it closed out, with a finality no boardroom decision could have managed, the family's Gilded Age ambitions on Cumberland Island. What was left afterward were 3 other mansions: Plum Orchard, Grayfield, Stafford, thousands of acres of maritime forest, and a family that was no longer a family in the sense Lucy Carnegie would have recognized it. Her descendants numbered by then in the dozens, spread across branches with competing claims, and no single voice speaking for the whole estate. 90% of an island is a difficult thing to inherit collectively. It is a harder thing still to maintain. There was no bridge to the mainland, and there never had been. Every plank of lumber, every gallon of fuel, every repair to a roof or a dock had to arrive by boat, at a cost that made sense only when the family funding it still treated the island as a private nation rather than a piece of real estate. By the 1960s, with development pressure creeping up the Georgia coast and the heirs increasingly scattered, some wealthy, some not, none willing or able to fund the old arrangement alone, Cumberland Island had become something the builders could not have imagined, a liability measured in acreage. What the family did next was not written into any will. It was worked out slowly and with considerable reluctance from some branches, across a series of meetings with men who worked for the federal government. Chapter 7. The Terms of Surrender. The men who worked for the federal government did not arrive with an offer of purchase. They arrived with a proposal for a slow surrender, one negotiated house by house, branch by branch, across nearly 2 decades in which the Carnegie descendants held more leverage than their diminished fortunes might have suggested. Cumberland Island was not, by the late 1950s, a single estate answering to a single will. It was a patchwork of parcels held by cousins, nieces, and grandchildren scattered from New York to California, each with a different attachment to the place and a different price for leaving it. What united them was not sentiment. It was the demand that whatever happened next would happen on their terms. Those terms were specific, and they were non-negotiable. Any family member who agreed to sell would retain the right to remain in their house for the rest of their life. The government would own the land in name before it owned the land in fact, and some Carnegies would die in their beds on Cumberland Island decades after signing away their children's inheritance. The second demand cut deeper into the island's future than the first. The National Park Service was required to put in writing a promise that no bridge would ever connect Cumberland to the mainland, no pavement, no easy crossing, no procession of day trippers arriving by car. Access would remain what it had always been: a boat, a tide table, a measure of inconvenience that had once kept the world out for Thomas Carnegie's pleasure and would now keep it out for the sake of preservation. The family had lost the empire. They had not lost the argument over how it would end. Not every branch agreed even to that. The Fergusons, who held Grayfield, one of the mansions Lucy Carnegie had built for her children, declined to sell at any price, under any condition. They kept the house, kept the furniture, kept the portraits on the walls, and turned the family home into an inn. Guests today sleep in rooms where a Carnegie once slept, served meals in a dining room built for a family that no longer owns the island around it. It was a private accommodation arrived at independently of the larger settlement, and it left one mansion permanently outside the federal boundary the rest of the family was drawing around itself. The negotiations dragged through the 1960s without resolution, a slow accumulation of small agreements that never quite added to a whole. What broke the stalemate was a gift, not a sale. In 1971, the family donated Plum Orchard itself, the largest and most ambitious of the 4 mansions, to the National Park Foundation outright. It was a gesture with no lifetime clause attached, no condition beyond the transfer, and its timing was not incidental. Congress had been sitting on the enabling legislation for years. The donation is credited with tipping it forward. On October 23, 1972, President Richard Nixon signed the bill establishing Cumberland Island National Seashore. 2 decades of meetings, refusals, and carefully worded promises ended in a single signature in Washington, thousands of miles from the marsh grass and the ruined walls of Dungeness. The family that had once owned 9/10 of the island now owned, in most cases, nothing at all, only memories, and in the Fergusons' case, a working inn. What passed into federal hands was not a modest tract. Roughly 36,000 acres came under protection that day, and of those, some 20,000 were designated wilderness, land on which no further construction, no roads, no development of any kind would ever be permitted. It was, on paper, the largest undeveloped barrier island on the eastern seaboard, secured in perpetuity. What remained to be seen was what 36,000 acres of promises would actually look like on the ground, decades later, once the ink had dried, and the horses the family once imported were left to do as they pleased. Chapter 8. What Remains? The National Park Service has capped visitation at 300 people a day since the 1980s, and every one of them arrives the same way, on a single passenger ferry out of St. Mary's, 30 minutes across the Sound, with no return before the boat says so. There are no hotels open to the public on Cumberland Island. Paved roads for public traffic don't exist either, and neither does a bridge. That last promise, demanded in writing by the family before most of the remaining branches sold their holdings in the 1970s, has since been made redundant by 4 decades of federal wilderness designation. 20,000 of the island's 36,000 acres are now legally protected from the kind of development the Carnegies once imagined for themselves. The island the family fought quietly and at length to keep from becoming another Jekyll or another St. Simon's is now bound by statute to stay exactly that, undeveloped. What began as private preference has calcified into public law. In September 1996, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette were married in secret in the island's one-room First African Baptist Church, a wooden building with 12 pews and no electricity, 40 miles from the nearest paparazzo. The reception was held at Grayfield, the Fergusons' inn, under oak canopy the Carnegies had planted or preserved a century earlier. The wedding made the island briefly, involuntarily famous, proof that whatever Cumberland had become, it had not become ordinary. The horses did not attend anyone's wedding, and no one has ever counted them with precision. Between 150 and 200 feral horses live on Cumberland Island today, descendants of colonial stock and the Carnegie bloodlines added to it in the 1890s, and they constitute the only unmanaged feral horse herd on the entire Atlantic coast. The Park Service does not feed them, water them, vaccinate them, or cull them. Policy holds that the herd is to be left alone entirely as though it were weather. In 2023, advocates sued over the animal's visible malnourishment, and in 2024, a federal judge dismissed the case on procedural grounds while still urging the responsible agencies to act. Nothing has changed. The horses that once grazed the Carnegies' private lawns now graze without a fence line anywhere on the island, and they wander, unremarked, through the roofless brick shell of Dungeness itself. Of the 4 Carnegie houses, one stands as ruin, one stands restored, one stands inhabited. Dungeness remains exactly as the 1959 fire left it. Blackened brick walls open to the sky, window frames with nothing behind them, a chimney rising into the oak canopy, horses cropping grass on the lawn where the family's golf course once ran. Plum Orchard, the son's wedding gift, was donated to the Park Service in 1971 and has been restored. Rangers lead tours through its rooms on a schedule. Grayfield alone is still lived in by the family that built it. reachable only by the Fergusons' own boat, still run as a small inn. Stafford, the fourth house, Main Parston Sauer Staffersee, remains outside that public record in any comparable detail. As recently as 2024, the Park Service proposed a land exchange that would let the remaining Carnegie and Candler descendants consolidate their holdings and build new houses, some with footprints as large as 15,000 square feet. Conservation groups called it a return to Gilded Age construction on ground the public had been promised would stay primitive. Nearly a century and a half after Thomas and Lucy Carnegie first built a mansion on a barrier island with no bridge to it, their descendants are still negotiating, acre by acre, how much of that island a family named Carnegie gets to keep. The stone walls of Dungeness are still standing, 4 stories of brick with nothing above them but sky, and the live oaks have gone on being patient, their moss hanging lower now over rooms with no roof to stop it. Late in the afternoon, the light comes low through the empty windows and lands on the floor where a ballroom used to be, and a horse crosses that light without hurrying, unowned, unnamed, unafraid of a house it has never been asked to leave. The water is still out past the marsh, and the sky is still large above all of it, and that is what remains.